Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Meet the Author, arranged by the Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm your host, Naeem Mahmood. Tonight, we have the honor to have Peter Oborne with us to talk about his book, The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, published in May 2022. We thank Peter for joining us this evening. Now, a few words about Peter Oborne. He is an award-winning writer, reporter, and broadcaster who has worked for various newspapers, including The Spectator, The Daily Mail, and The Daily Telegraph, where he was the chief political commentator until he resigned from the paper in 2015. He now writes for Middle East Eye and Byline Times. Byline Times, yeah. He authored a number of books, including The Rise of Political Lying, 2005, The Triumph of Political Class, 2007, Owned a Tiger, 2014, and The Assault on Truth, 2021. Now, a few words about the Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. The Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, CAMES in short, is a non-partisan organization based in London, promoting activities to understand Asia and Europe and Middle East better, and acts as a hub for engaging with these regions, arts, culture, and politics. We engage through research and dialogue to facilitate a better understanding of these regions from socio-economic and political viewpoints. Recently, we have arranged a number of lecture series on terrorism, colonialism, the Ottoman Empire, and civilizational studies. We have also arranged interviews on the events unfolding in India, Libya, and Egypt. So that is the bit of introduction of tonight's program. Now we're going to the main part, but before that, I'd like to let you know the format of tonight's program. We'll start with questions already in hand, and then it will be followed by the questions from the audience. We are hoping to wrap up the session in 1 hour and 30 minutes. Just to let everyone know that we follow some rules. We ask the audience to keep mic and mobile muted until told otherwise. We encourage questions and comments, maintaining professional approach. Now, you might wonder about the reasons of selecting this book, The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, by Peter. Well, here are a few reasons. Firstly, it is one of the books that addressed the very pertaining issue of misunderstanding of Islam and Muslims by the West from the first-hand knowledge and experience. Numerous books from Bede, the 8th century English scholar, who is also known as the father of English history, to Samuel P. Huntington, who is known for the book The Clash of Civilization, wrote on Islam and Muslims without any reliable and first-hand knowledge. Peter, on the other hand, is different. He has been in touch with the Muslim communities in the UK for decades. He visited a number of Muslim majority countries, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and so forth. So he had the opportunity to observe the mainstream media bias and political rhetorics in the UK, and the reality on the ground in those Muslim majority countries and at home in the Muslim communities. Secondly, this book is the essence of his 20 years long research and knowledge on Islam and Muslims. Thirdly, the book has summarized all the major causes of misunderstanding of Islam in the West from both historical and personal knowledge of his interaction with the Muslims. So these are the reasons in short, of course. We'll know more about it in details from Peter later on. Now I would like to go straight to the questions, and we'll start the questions that I have in hand. Right, so Peter, so let's start with the Iraq War. You wrote about it at the very beginning of the book, and you said that Iraq War and how it affected, you talked about Iraq War and how it affected everything you believed. Tell us how the Iraq War was impacted you and how it became a turning point in your life. A bit of background of the book, actually.
Yes, that's so you listed the kind of publications I used to write for, which would include the the Spectator, Daily Mail, Telegraph, all very respectable, but you put a lot of people here would probably agree would have now become Islamophobic publications, bigoted publications. Now, I was a writer for those kind of organizations, and I grew up. I sort of came to my, I made my way sort of believing in the virtue of the British state, and I still do in some ways, but the Iraq War really hit me really hard. I found it was obviously far more important for the people, the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than a million people who were killed as a result, in all sorts of different areas, the sort of people, the pain and the anger and which swept through the whole region. But as somebody who believed in the decency of the British state, and we stood for something rather wonderful, to realize that we'd been associated in an illegal war, and we'd been lied our way into it, really was, I found, very difficult to come to terms with. And then in the aftermath of it, I really reconsidered who I was and what sort of journalist I wanted to be. And what I realized was that there was what I came to realize, it was a long study, that there is a false narrative about British Muslims. And you have to link that narrative to British foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. And so what I'm trying to do here in this book was to show how this false narrative about Islam was created, and show how that was linked to British and American and European policies, particularly in the Middle East and across the Muslim world. Does that make some sort of sense?
Yeah, indeed. Okay.
I mean, it was terribly shocking to realize that we've been lied to war, then to witness things like Abu Ghraib, and then Guantanamo, which is still open, where it has only ever housed Muslim males. I've got to know some of them. It's a terrible. It's a complete abandonment of the values which the West claims to stand for.
Yeah, you talked about the truth in British politics, and you had been a close observant of the politics and media campaign regarding the Iraq War, and you were deeply dismayed by it. You said, and I quote, "I read it deeply and started to understand that truth, as I had been brought up to understand it, based on empirical evidence, which could be independently tested, no longer existed. I heard that it had turned into an instrument of power, a weapon to be used and manipulated for political advantage." So do you still hold this opinion regarding British politics? And why do you think the truth is eroding from British politics?
Yeah, because I work in the media, and I was at the insight of if you look at the run up to the campaign to the Iraq War, and then the coverage of it afterwards, it actually, in terms of media terms, it's been repeated again and again. If you look at in a foreign affairs, first of all, let's look at the reasons given for the intervention in Libya, which was as far as we can tell, largely fabricated claims that there was going to be a genocide in Benghazi. Or I'm not, as some people probably watching this might know, I've been very powerfully for a long time involved in the Trojan horse story.
Yeah.
which was a witch hunt against a British Muslim, very honourable British Muslim teachers who have been basically, had their campaigns, had their careers removed from them, and the full stories or told about them. I'm still working on that issue. I think there's a grave, terrible injustice. If you look at the coverage of it's not particularly relevant, but it is relevant because Jeremy Corbyn was a voice in this area, about the endless smears which were aimed at Jeremy Corbyn. So I have lost faith, and then you can look at a lot of the discourse around Brexit. And so I've lost, I've actually not really allowed to write in the British press, in the mainstream British press anymore, because the more I examined issues like this, the more it became clear to me that there was a pattern of fabrication, which has repeated itself both in again and again, and there is the general issue of Islamophobia, which sort of brings together a lot of these themes, where you can write falsehoods, run campaigns against 3 million of our fellow citizens. And there was I quite discovered this quote years ago, and it's always stayed with me. It was a 19th century American journalist, that the job of a journalist is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. It's quite a nice definition of what we should do. And the job of the mainstream media in Britain, or what the mainstream media in Britain does too much of, is to afflict the afflicted and to comfort the comfortable.
Yeah, well, you had been at the center of British media for many, many years, and you had that opportunity to observe the media narrative, which were unfolding during the Iraq invasion and subsequent wars in the Muslim lands. So you said, and I quote, "Many British journalists were actually instruments of power and part of a client media class that worked alongside and formed part of government elite." So do you think much has changed now, given the current media narratives on minorities, immigration, and Muslims?
I think this has not changed at all, unfortunately. And this is a really terrible condemnation of journalists. The other thing which upsets me about British mainstream journalists is that they are privileged. As part of the research for the book, I did a great deal of traveling abroad, often in countries where there were, civil wars or repressions going on. And you realize that, you need to work with local people on the ground who take, often journalists, who are actually risking their lives and their families' lives and their livelihoods by helping you often. Now, all of the British journalist who writes a lie about the British Muslims is risking, well, it's nothing at all. And if he were to challenge the orthodoxy, the most he's going to risk is maybe his job or her job. And so there's the privileged basis upon which mainstream Western journalists operate is almost beyond belief when you compare it to the phenomenal journalists I've had the honor of meeting, some of them dead now, who try and tell the truth and across the rest, much of the world.
Yeah. With regard to the freedom of British Muslims, you talked a lot about it in the book, and you mentioned and I quote, "My freedoms are not under threat." Muslims, however, are subject to arbitrary arrest. Their bank accounts get frozen for no apparent reason. They get labeled and insulted at will in the national press and in broadcasting media, and slandered and spat at or physically attacked in the streets. The question is, why is it so, and how does it help in building a better Britain?
Is, you see, one of the things with what I do in the book, one of the sections is I think it's part 4 of the book. I examine the way in which this idea of British Muslims and of Islam in Britain and across the world has been constructed. And in Britain, we actually have a wonderful multicultural heritage, which allows people to be subversives, to be orthodox, to be mainstream, to be gay, to be Jewish, to be Hindu, to be Muslim, to be Christian, to be Scottish, Welsh, English, to have all kinds of different identities. And in the name of, and I show in the book that this new concept has been invented. It's not a word which has been in, or the phrase which has been in the English language. There are several. There's extremism, there's Islamism, there's non-violent extremism. These have all been weaponized, these ideas, including this idea of British values, which never really, scarcely ever used before about 2005, 10. And it's used to, and I showed this very carefully, to define British values as used not in the way in which I've always or known, and we, as Britishness, which is a generous and capacious identity. It means that anybody who is opposed to those things is an extremist. And it has been invented by think tanks and in government as a way of stigmatizing, i.e. non-adherence to so-called British values, a minority. I mean, it could be several minorities, but the primary minority which it's aimed at is British Muslims. And this lies behind the ideological attack on so-called Islamism at the time of the Trojan horse affair and various other moral panics which have been instrumentalized by government, well, with the assent of government, normally through the mainstream media, against Muslims for the last few years. Because actually, one of the paradoxes is that there is no section of British society which is more British than British Muslims. Surveys show this in terms of that, you know, that their love of Britain, British Muslims feel safe in this country, are given a place because of our multiculturalism. We're not like France. But there is a major movement which works through the press, which is trying to turn us into the same sort of framework, political and sort of moral framework as France, where you're only allowed one national identity.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You talked at length about France and US as well. You gave historical details there, and which are really interesting to read. Now, with regard to constant media bias, so media bias and propaganda can mislead people, which I've seen, which in turn can increase hostility, discrimination, and marginalization of Muslim community. Also, the negative political rhetorics and Islamophobia from mainstream politics don't help either. Rather, they empower the radical elements of both sides, which could lead to more extremism and fundamentalism and attack. Now, the petrol bomb attack in the immigration center in Dover happened recently, I guess in October, and another attack in 23rd December in France, in Paris, by right-wing extremists, killed 3 Muslims. So doesn't this kind of rhetoric against Muslim and Islam empowers the extremists more? And being at the center of the political power, most of the politicians, they know that this kind of rhetoric and this kind of extreme views against any minorities, let alone Muslim, doesn't help build a better country. Why do we still see this kind of narratives against Muslims or other communities, minorities are still there very much in the mainstream media and mainstream politics?
Yeah, I think there are there's quite a lot of different kinds of answers to that question. And look, one is that there are lots of bigots in this society, as in any society, I'm afraid. And this kind of talk kind of makes sense to them. There's lots of people angry. They don't know why they're angry and what they're angry about, but they're marginalized them, or they're losing out, or they feel resentment. And this provides, currently, I'm afraid that it's not a very cheerful thing to say too. I think we're talking among a largely Muslim audience here, that Muslims are the butt of a lot of that resentment. That resentment, I tried to write this book, is based on ignorance. I mean, by the way, I'm not defending every Muslim. I don't think I am. We're all fallible. We're all human. We're all capable of evil. And there are some Muslims who do very bad and stupid things. I'm not saying that there aren't, as there are Christians, etc. But all of us are fallen. But this idea that as a class, Muslims are sort of somehow how dangerous appeals to the ugliest, it's a very easy way of selling newspapers, making dramatic claims which are not true. I spent a lot of my time, Mohammed Barry will know how much time I've spent exposing these fabrications and myths and falsehoods aimed at the mainstream Muslim community in this country. And it is very, very difficult to rebut. And the reason I wrote this book, it was not fundamentally aimed at a Muslim audience. It was aimed at a sort of a mainstream audience in Britain, not especially Muslim, but the kinds of people who read the Telegraph or the Daily Mail, because I try to make it readable and accessible and tell it through stories, and so people can understand how their perceptions are being warped. But history shows us again and again that minorities do come under attack, unfortunately. And I'm just trying to, the reason I wrote the book was to try and explain some of what has been happening.
Okay. All right. We have a number of questions in the chat, and we have our audience as well who have their questions too. Peter, I can go on, but I would like to give them the opportunity to ask some questions to you straight. So please let me tell the audience, please make sure you raise your hands up in the participants section so that we can know who has the questions to ask. And also, may I ask Saif to tell us if that is possible to some of the questions in the chat as well. That would be really, really helpful. And in the meantime, if Sophia, do you like to ask any questions, if you have any?
Yes. Yes. So my first question, Peter, I've read the book and it's very interesting and well written, as well as very informative, and goes into great depth in some of the topics. So thanks, it's brilliant there. So my question is, the fate of Abraham, why the West is wrong about Islam. That's the title of the book. How did you decide on this title?
Well, there's always two elements. And the way that you look at most book titles, there's two titles. There's the short title, and then there's a sort of more explanatory one, equal, and they're all, you're only given about 8 words to work with. I chose Fate of Abraham, which is the arresting title, because of course, if you, the great Abraham is the patriarch of the three great monotheistic religions, which emerged more or less in the same time, more or less in the same place, not very far from each other in the Middle East. You know, over a period, and I think that it's saying, I think Abraham had a message to all peoples. He was going to be the father of all peoples, and so what I'm trying to say is that he can be appropriated, Abraham, as in all kinds of different ways, but he is actually the patriarch of Muslims, of Islam, of Judaism, and of Christianity. And he seeds us all. You know, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we are all, to use a phrase, Islamic phrase, the people of the book.
Yes. Okay.
That's how I came across that. The second one, why the West is wrong about Islam, is much more explanatory. You know, is much. That's what I'm trying to explain. I'm trying to, in many ways, fundamentally, the book is not about Islam; it's about the West.
Okay, so Sophia, do you have any more questions to ask? Or
yeah, the second question is just a second. It was a bit unrelated to the first question. It's very unrelated, but okay. So the second question is, you mentioned in your book, very initially in introduction, that the International Crisis Group categorized Tabligh Jamaat as a revivalist group interested not in political power, but in spiritual and moral regeneration. There are claims that Tabligh Jamaat, now this is not in your book, okay? So this is just my question part. So there are claims that Tabligh Jamaat is an agent of British colonial power. It was established as a religious revivalist movement to disarm the passive and pacify Muslims of India, British, with the rise of communal tension by the rise of communal tension in the 1920s. In your sort of knowledge, would you say these claims are credible?
I don't know. I don't know too much about Tabligh Jamaat. I just was quoting using the International Crisis Group definitions, and I thought that was important. But I have no idea whether Tabligh Jamaat was a sort of a project of the British or not. Right,
because I mean, it was in chapter 4, in the part 4, where you mentioned a lot about the PREVENT program as how the British have the intelligence have set that up. So I just wondered if there's any connection. Obviously,
in part 4, I did trace some of the terms which have become very familiar as part of the counter-extremism program in Britain, or the so-called PREVENT program. You can trace the term moderate and the term extremist back to the British Empire, when, as I said in the book, that a moderate Indian was an Indian who was very charming to the British people in charge and didn't want to upset the apple cart. These were moderates. Whereas an extremist was somebody who you chucked into jail as soon as possible. And that was a way. And extremism of extremists, of course, was a way of stigmatizing everybody who wanted to change society. You know, the suffragettes were stigmatized as extremists, and the moderates were those sensible women who didn't want to get above themselves and understood that they were too dim to get the vote. You see what I mean? And then, of course, extremist was applied to people who wanted Indian independence, whereas the moderates were those who wanted to work with the Brits.
Well, I guess that applies to all sort of dynamics, isn't it, in terms of relationships and power politics everywhere, that if you agree, then you're collaborating and you're the moderate. And if you disagree, you're going to be the extremist on the other side.
Yeah, except that there's a special privilege given to mainstream white politicians in this country who are actually encouraged to be radical. And so they will tell you they have radical policies. You know, I'm sure that Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak would tell you that they were radicals. So they tend to do this because they're actually very conformist and they want to make themselves a bit more interesting. So they say we're radical. Tony Blair was always being radical, you might recall. And the reason for that is I think that there's no danger in their radicalism. But if you say that they were moderates, on the other hand, which is a term of praise when handed out to Muslims, that's actually he's rather moderate. Means he's not much good. It's an interesting dual language, a sort of racist language.
Yes, thank you. I will let others ask you the questions, but thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Sophia. I guess, Saif, do you have your questions ready, you think?
I think Misbah wanted to ask a question. He raised a hand. And is Misbah here? Can you unmute?
I am.
Okay, brilliant. Go ahead.
So, hello, Mr. Oborne. So I don't want to take you away from the general thrust of the discussion today, but you did start off talking about British society. So I put my question in the chat, but I'll read it out. I said, do you think this is a trope of British society in that we currently see antagonism towards Russia or Russian citizens, and is possibly or likely that we will see the demonization of the Chinese if Sino-UK relations deteriorate?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's quite an interesting question. That I think there's a different context here, which is that we are not at war with Russia, but we are in a kind of we're in a conflict. There is a conflict, which is a proxy war between Britain and Russia, and in those sorts of circumstances, Russian citizens tend to get treated with a certain amount of chilliness. You know, if you think about Germans in World War One, you know, you know, they got I think it's a different kind of reason. You know, that ever since the invasion of Russians were very welcome in Britain, sometimes for the wrong reasons. They had loads of money, and they were. But and they were buying their way into British politics, etc. But generally speaking, Russians have long been very welcome in this country. But what's happened since the illegal invasion, a war of aggression was launched by Putin a year ago, it's not that surprising that there's been a hostility towards. Wrong, because you can't blame ordinary Russians for the actions of the Russian state, and quite a few of the Russians who are currently here would be strongly opposed to Putin's invasion, and also would or maybe had to flee Russia because of their opposition to it. So I think this counts as xenophobia, you might call it, hostility towards Russians who find themselves here. It's a bad thing. Got wonderful Russians in Britain.
Okay. We see the hands of Dr. Abdul Bari. Dr. Abdul Bari, go ahead, please. Unmute yourself. Yeah, you need to unmute yourself, Dr.
Okay, sorry. Thanks, Peter. And it's once again, it's really an interesting discussion. And you work in the mainstream, and I worked in the Muslim Council of Britain. So I have come across many of the things that you have mentioned in the book through my personal experience, but that was my experience. And you probably are the only sort of right-wing media operator to more or less change this side and just for justice sake, you have been defending Muslims and other minorities and society, the civil society. But I don't see any other. Media personality, not even near you, who come out and write for justice for Muslims or others. And in a way, in 777 time when I was the leader of CB, we got lot of support from civil society, interfaith organizations, and also a lot of politicians. Gradually, when the Tory government came and things have as well as friends, more enemies, if I can use the word enemy. So we have been, in a way, relatively weaker in the last decade. That means from 2010 onward. And the fact that I don't see, probably I may be wrong, other people coming up and take up the battle for justice, does this mean that British society overall is losing something? And because justice is the not only worldly issues, it's the heavenly issues. If there is injustice anywhere in the world, that will not go forever. Ultimately, that will be taken up by God, that we believe. So my worry is, like France, which is publicly showing Islamophobic rhetoric, even by their president, we don't see, and it's a bit different in here, but the rhetoric has not come down, rather it has gone up. And you have written this book, and Policy Exchange has come up with their own report again. And someone like Khalid Mahmoud has written some forward in it, attacking you. So what is going on in this country? And it's very difficult to say, but I'm really worried about the overall Britain as well as Muslims in this country.
Yeah, there was slightly fuzzy audio. I think I know what you said. We're talking about though, Mohammed. There, can everybody else hear me? No, yeah. There's a policy exchange has played a major role. I have a chapter on policy exchange in the book, because I show how it's tried to reconfigure the idea of what it is to be British, to attack the idea of multiculturalism, an idea, the whole historical legacy of, for all the many faults of empire, the aftermath of empire, it did leave us with a multicultural society, which was quite similar, say, to what happened under the Ottomans and so on, where all minorities, religions, and faiths could live together. And there is a very conscious and determined attempt to abolish that and demand that, and create a new kind of, you might almost call it religion, I think, in Britain, which is secular liberalism, which is almost the unacknowledged, it is the unacknowledged national. religion, and it just, and the heavy implication of that is that religion is an entirely private matter, and if you bring it into the public domain, and that's like religious assemblies in schools, as well as things like bishops in the House of Lords and religious movements, you're going to get you're somehow a threat to the state or the dominant culture. And this has been a very successful project. This book is partly about that. And Muslims are the primary target. I think it's important to note that it's not the only target. I think ultimately all religions are similarly targeted by secular liberals. But what makes the position maybe of Muslims especially vulnerable at the moment is there's a double-sided attack. You get the progressive attack on the secular liberal attack, where the easiest and most obvious target is Muslims, because they, to be honest, to put it very simply, they're more like Muslims believe in God in a way which a lot of Anglicans, for instance, or British Christians don't. I mean, in quite the same way. It's that. And of course, you then have the bigotry of the right. And so you get this, say on Trojan Horse, where going on to the report there, you get this fascinating, or I say fascinating, but it's very powerful alliance between the liberal center and the rabid right. So that would, in newspaper terms, that's say the Observer newspaper, on the one hand, which you'd expect to be supportive of minorities, is just as devoted to the conspiracy theory about Trojan Horse as the Sun or the Daily Telegraph, and that makes it quite hard for Muslims at the moment. It certainly, and I think that Trojan Horse, by the way, that report, which does, it has a small chapter partly about me and Professor Homewood, who's written that terrifically important book on the Trojan Horse affair, and we come under attack. I'm thinking about ways of addressing those criticisms, because it was 181 pages from Policy Exchange with a foreword by Michael Gove, who's still in the cabinet. Was the author of Celsius 77. And also the education secretary at the time of the height of the Trojan Horse affair, and has written along with Nick Timothy, who was at one point a senior figure inside Theresa May's Downing Street, has written a joint introduction in which they say that these are the facts about Trojan Horse. There are no other facts. They're challenged by activist academics or activist journalists or useful idiots. They're very derogatory about people like me who say, look, these are not the facts. Actually, we're accused of inventing alternative narratives or something like alternative facts. We're sort of seen as, and this is quite sinister, because you will have seen from Policy Exchange, it's also another paper from them arguing that anybody who challenges the prevent strategy is themselves an extremist. So there's a very concerted attempt going on from Policy Exchange and other organizations, which are very close to the Sunak government and before then to the Truss or Johnson government, which are, to attack civil society organizations which refuse to conform to the government narrative. We've seen that, and this is modeled on what Macron did in France, and they clearly want to do the same thing. Tony Blair had a bit of a go at it after after the atrocity of 7/7. And we are, and I think they are partly trying to clear the way for the development of what you might call a new security architecture towards British Islam, and that will come with the Shawcross report into Prevent, and the reconfiguration of Contest, I think it's called, the counterterrorism strategy. And at the heart of this, I think, is an idea which has been introduced into British public discourse, the idea of thought crime or non-violent extremism, i.e. you can be thinking things or reading things which have nothing to do with violence, but thoughts which are outside the mainstream, and that is somehow a threat to the state, and that is a profoundly un-British idea, where we have been British. At the heart of the idea of Britishness has been a concept, not that you can, of freedom of speech and conscience.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I see the Andrew has raised his hand up. Andrew, could you unmute yourself and please push your question through? Yep, we can't hear you. Could you unmute yourself, please? We still can't hear you. No. Yeah.
I'm here.
Go ahead.
Here. I'm so sorry. I was being told that I wasn't allowed to unmute. I was going to ask Peter about the link between the book he's published, which I have also read, and a couple of other books that he's written in the past, prompted by the things he's just been saying. Peter Oborne wrote a book about political narratives before the rise of political lying, and another book about the rotation of elites, the rise of the political class, I think it was called. And you've just been talking about a false narrative and this very sinister thing of putting forward a false narrative that the other person's story is a false narrative, which is a very Russian tactic. I remember I actually met you about 20 years ago. We had a long talk about, well, a short talk about Foucault and narratives and so on. It was in North London about 20 years ago. And I think I lost your interest at the point I did, that the things happening under Tony Blair were capable of moving in the direction of fascism. And you may find it a very unhelpful word, I suspect you will, but you've just been talking as well about an organization wishing to abolish the difference between government and civil society without doing it formally. I'm wondering if you think that that word is becoming a more appropriate word for describing what's going on.
Do you want me? Yeah. It's actually, I'm just primarily, I'm wary about the word fascism because it means, it takes you very quickly to Nazism, which is one of the variations. And I think it's for that reason unhelpful. I think let's try and look at the term formally. I mean for ALLY. And I think actually when we had our discussion, which Max Belov, had he not, the Professor of Political Science, had written an article saying there was something potentially fascistic about the New Labour movement. And I'm trying to remember his arguments, that there was something authoritarian about it, that it didn't tolerate dissent, and there was a sort of cult of the leader about it, which and I think there were other. I mean, there were interesting arguments. We're not saying that Tony Blair was an incipient Hitler who was about to go and do those kinds of attacks on. But there is, if you look at the idea of fascism as an anti-working class alliance, is this right, between involving large corporations and the state, yes. And the rigid regimentation of the press? I think we are moving in that kind of direction, very much so. I think we are. This is a fulcrum moment in British history. We're at the quite early stages of it, but you can see Boris Johnson was a sort of was another attempt to move in that direction, and though he drew on all kinds of Blairite practices, you know, the cult of the leader, the hostility towards independent in state institutions, i.e., the civil service and Parliament, and this very sinister aggregation of power between press and government, i.e., Johnson's power base was the media, but I've written a lot about this, not in this book particularly, but in other books. He embraced the media as it became part of the state in important ways, and there is a possibility. It was the only thing about Johnson's attempt to do this, which was quite successful for a time, was that he wasn't methodical about it. It was badly organized, but you could see all the ingredients, many of the ingredients were there. Just as Trump it had many of the same ingredients, and that failed because Trump was actually at heart a buffoon, and the same applied to Boris. Actually, we can take heart from these two failures, and now where we go from it will try and come back. It will try and come back. It's a very unstable situation. What we haven't had yet is an economic collapse, or a mass unemployment, or the sort of things which really generate swift political change in Britain. And what will happen then? I think it's an attempt. Does that make some sense? Yes. To answer your question.
Yes, it does. I think the problem with the Belloff article all those years ago was that the focus on Tony Blair was a bit of a miscue. Tony Blair taken at his own estimation, really, and it was more what was behind him than who he was that was important. I thought the cult of the leader was the least important thing, and I think we are beginning to see these problems arising. And I do just want to thank you, because you've been consistently writing very principled, rigorous, researched, clear books, alerting people to these inconsistencies, and I think it's been an extremely valuable service.
Thank you. It's nice. It's nice. It's one of the nicest compliments I've ever had. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for making those comments and points. Now, Rubaiyat, do you like to raise your questions? Are you there, Rubaiyat? I think we lost connection with Rubaiyat. Let's go to the Saif then. Saif.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Peter, thank you very much. This is it's a delightful book to read. It's very readable, very interesting, holds your attention, sort of very spellbinding, very, very interesting book. And I'm sure people who are not very familiar with the history of the West vis-a-vis Islam would benefit a lot from reading this particular book. I would like to, I mean, since we have been discussing about the present era and what is happening in Britain and Muslims, I would like to go back 160, 165 years back, 1857, which you address in your book. So 1857, for people who were not well aware of, is the year of first war of independence, as Hindustani people would call it, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and so on and so forth would call it, or how the British colonizers portrayed it as the Indian Mutiny. In 1857, we saw something very interesting, that the portrayal of these rebels, these revolutionaries, became quite distorted. They were portrayed in a very, very distorted light. Not only that, you talk about, for example, you talk about Charles Dickens writing, fantasizing about genocide of Indians, or whom he called Hindus with double O's. So indiscriminately, he's fantasizing about, if he has been given this particular power, he would do this and that. Similarly, you talk about the stage play Jesse Brown, in which Nana Sahib was a Marathi Brahmin ruler in Kanpur, in the southern area of Awadh, and he is portrayed in this particular play as a Muslim. So I would like to know, from your studies of this particular era, how were the Muslim, first of all, how widespread this distorted sort of evil portrayal of Muslims was, how widespread this vilification was of the Muslims, and secondly, how well it was received in the public, in the common public, not in the elites, but in the common public.
Yeah, you can see in the popular literature and doubtless the press portrayals of a number of kind of prototypes for and in the 18th century as well. So, for someone like Saddam Hussein in the kind of mainstream British press, the Tipu Sultan is another, really brilliant ruler who in India in the 18th century, who was portrayed in many ways much more sophisticated than the British, and even more advanced, and technologically, that is to say. Yeah, he gets portrayed as some sort of demon. This is what there's always a personal element to this section of the book, because I was brought up I went to a prep school which was full of novels by G.H. Henty, and who was the great, actually they were spellbindingly readable when I was about 9 years old, which always had a white hero and a villainous Muslim, the ones which dealt with the Muslim world, and then a loyal, faithful Muslim, of course, who would be very brave and rescue the white hero from a terrible fate, and then he would become. He had quite profound meditations, G.H. Henty. I do find Macaulay. Have you read Macaulay? The essays of Macaulay? If you have, you should do so, because they're very explanatory. Macaulay, who had a very senior position, it was one of the least important parts of his life, but he was a very senior position in India for a while, in the administration there. He was a literary genius and a historical genius, a brilliant mind. And he wrote a history of England, which is about 3 volumes long and completely compulsively readable. It's called The History of England. It deals with the years 1685 to 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution against Abs. And I've read all 3 of those. I couldn't put them up. And these literary and political essays have phenomenal accounts, brilliant accounts, unpublishable possibly today, actually, because they're out of print, of Clive of India, the Elder Pitt, and all of these figures who created empire. And created what you have to say was the British national myth in many ways, up to, but not after 1940. Right? I mean, but you can bear it because it's, and one of the things when I was at university almost 50 years ago now, there was no, at Cambridge University, there was no real conceptual explanation for imperialism. It was just seen as something, a bit of an oddity. We were taught British history from a left-wing perspective very often, the rise of organized labor, the rise of democracy, the rise of ultra feminism, and the overturning of absolute monarchy and the rise of, and what but nobody, not even the great historians like A.J.P. Taylor, were able really to give a cohesive or even an interesting, it was almost an adornment. It was written as imperialism, and a bit of irrational popular sentiment of no great importance because but of course, looking 50 years later, aided and abetted by critical race theory, which I hope you can look at, you can reread. I'm going to reread Macaulay. I literally couldn't put it down, those essays, and see what I make of them. Because as a new generation, there's been a reinterpretation of that part of our history, and I want to know. I want, yeah. Is that an attempt to answer some of your questions? Not really, but I'll do my best here.
No, fantastic. I mean, yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the key points which fascinated me reading your book is the emphasis on creation of language, creation of concepts. So it's not only a kind of a geographical conquest, but it's also a psychological and philosophical conquest, in which new concepts, new epistemology, new ontologies are being developed, new systems of concepts are being developed. Like you emphasized in this particular talk as well, that you have non-violent extremists who are doing thought crimes now, and so on and so forth. So these people are being vilified, these Muslims or non-Muslims as well, Hindustani non-Muslims as well, are being portrayed as, in many ways, thought criminals. It
is the new, and it's such an un-British idea that for having a heretical, the word is extremism, which crops up all the time, and it's used as a way of defining the enemies of the state. Is all that is the modern word actually was for heretic. And heresy, we in Britain, and this is a strong part of our intellectual and moral and religious tradition. Is something we would fight for the underdog. We'd stand up for the underdog, and the extremists. The word extremist just means, the witches who were put on the stake in the 17th century, the dissenters who refused to go to war at the start of in World War I or whatever it was. The extremist is the suffragettes who fought for the women's vote. They're all extremists, and we've got to. That's what I'm trying. We have got a great weight of tradition and learning and intellect behind what we have to. What I hope to do is to set out a different way of seeing the world and seeing what it means to be a British citizen. So the kind of narrative which there is a major attempt to impose by the Conservative, and I guess probably the Labour is not fighting against it either, but the new elite is trying to impose a particular form of citizenship, which is very un-British, and they're doing it in the name of British values.
So is this one of the moral drivers which made you write this particular book, that the belief in fighting for the underdog? So you see
the driver.
Yeah. And now, I mean, just the other thing which I wanted to ask your opinion about is the Bengal famine of 1943 and 44. which is quite important, but unfortunately not many people have written. I mean, there is more new literature coming up and research coming up on that. And I've been reading about this, and a couple of articles written by Indian economists, specifically Utsa Patnaik. So people who are not familiar with Utsa Patnaik is a Marxist economist and sort of a historian. And she has done a lot of good work on studying the colonial history of Hindustan and the present and the effects of the aftermath of that particular era. And in this particular article, which I was reading, she talks about how John Maynard Keynes, who is one of the foremost sort of economists, liberal economist, a sort of an icon of liberal socialist sort of economist model in which the government is supposed to help the underdog and so on. His other side comes into play, and around 1940s, 1942, he was given the position during the wartime, Second World War time. He was given the position for the affairs of India, economic affairs of India, and he specifically chose a particular policy which jacked up the prices of the commodities, but did not allow any kind of economic respite to the people. As a result of this particular policy, specifically this particular policy applied on Bengal, I mean, millions of people, a conservative estimate is 3 million people died in Bengal within 1 year time, 1943 to 44. And unfortunately, not many people talk about that or are aware about that. So, I mean, I would like to know your opinion about this, ideas about this. I'm sure you came across this.
I didn't. I don't know the. I have never read in detail about the Bengal famine, and
right.
Speaking out of total ignorance, I just make one observation. This is the old-fashioned Brit in me, right? We were fighting World War II against one of the greatest evil empires the world has known. And I can see that, you know, in the middle of that, there were some terrible things were done, like the bombing of Dresden and by the British. And ultimately, of course, I haven't read, I must read, I will read up about Bengal. In some ways, what I need to read, although I won't do it at once, but I will do it, I promise you. You know, I find it hard to believe that the British would systematically go out to cause, the British rulers in India would go out to systematically bring about the deaths of millions of people. But I can see that eye might have been off the ball because of the need to defeat Nazism. But I don't know if that's a defense. Is that a defense in your view?
I mean, I think it might be helpful if you read a bit more about the research which is coming up now. So I'll send a couple of papers to Naeem, and maybe Naeem can send these to you. It would be very interesting to have your views on those. So do you see that as we are having these discussions, these platforms and so on, so forth, do you see sort of a change in a public discourse where people will, I'm talking about not only Muslims, but non-Muslims, British or Western people, accepting or understanding or coming to terms with the sort of these horrifying crimes, terrible crimes which were done in the name of progress, civilization, or Western values, and so on and so forth? Do you see some sort of a change in shift in the public discourse, or do you see the stranglehold of Islamophobia so much that there is not much space for it?
Well, that's part of the idea of Islamophobia at the moment. I mean, what is, as far as I read history at university, and it's all about being challenged and asking difficult questions and finding the truth regardless of what your prejudices might be. That's what I learned, and what I try to bring that academic discipline into this kind of into what I do as a current affairs journalist. And therefore, the idea that people are going to do research which casts the British Empire or the history of Britain in a poor light is not something which threatens me in the least. What you can do is to you can have a very interesting, important intellectual discussion which has a little element of synthesis and antithesis, and getting, you know, finding to get nearer the truth and raising fresh questions. What we have now, of course, in the public domain is this attack on so-called woke woke, i.e. anybody who challenges the official narrative about British past, they are somehow accused of being unpatriotic, and then there's moves to stop them being banned from or not being able to communicate their ideas in universities. Now that is pretty fascist. You know, that is quite extraordinary. Did you see these historians coming together a week or so ago with this, including somebody I greatly respect, David Abulafia at Cambridge, the historian of early modern early modern Europe. I mean, I don't know what on earth, or late medieval Europe. I mean, what on earth he's thinking of? I mean, why is this supposed to be a great threat to who we are? We have to have the we want to know the truth. We've done terrible things. We have to acknowledge it. I also think we did do some pretty good things, you know, but that's another matter. We don't see themselves as good and bad. What is the truth?
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Peter. And thanks a lot for the reference of G.H. Macaulay. I will definitely look into it.
Out of print, the best edition to get is the Everyman edition, which was 1960.
Brilliant.
Quite hard to get hold of. There are other editions, but they're very Victorian, and they're in tiny print. And when you get to my age, reading stuff in specs is quite a problem. But they are a lot of them are amazingly good reads, and you learn a lot. He's an incredible genius.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Saif, for asking those questions, and Peter for answering them. Now, we'll go to Dr. Abdulbari next, but before that, let me remind the audience that the recording of this session and the information of our upcoming lecture series will be shared in our WhatsApp group. So the link has been shared already. So if you haven't joined it yet, please feel free to join in. Right, so Dr. Abdulbari, you are next. Go ahead, please. Dr. Abdulbari, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. I have got a couple of small questions. One is 2021 census has shown that people confessing Christianity, the proportion has gone down from 59 to 46%. And 2011, it was more, 2001. Are you worried about the future of Christianity? Because all religions have got religious values, and if Christianity or any religion becomes weaker, that means values can go down. Second question is, what message do you have for young British Muslims, talented young professional, and they are worried about being in the public domain or media and all sorts of reasons? Do you have any message for them? Because I know you probably cannot and should not probably say some of the things that I can say, but these are the two questions I have.
Yeah, and then actually I better call it a day because I've got to go in about 5 minutes. The Christianity, I do worry about it because less because I'm a Christian, more because I think religion matters. And I think it's about community as much as about, it stands for different sets of values in a state which is based on rights alone. It misses out on some of the deep insights of religion. So whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism, which is about the importance of compassion and sharing and love, and I think a form of humility too. And that's why I worry a bit about moves to disestablish the Church of England, because I think it would lead to downgrading of all religions in the States, not just Christianity. So that's the answer there. I mean, the things about the Christian Church, particularly the Anglican Church, of which I am a member, is, you know, I can see all sorts of things they should do which would widen and greatly increase their appeal. But I might suggest it when I next meet the Archbishop of Canterbury. But I don't, were I ever to meet him. And the other question to young Muslims, well, I think I would give. I have been negative about this attack, I think, on religion in the public space, which Islam is the forefront of this, bearing the brunt of it. But there are some wonderful things still about Britain, and you know, I think there are great arguments to be won. It's just a question of fighting them in the right way, and I think this is, and that's what I hope we should do. And I always say to young Muslims, actually, or young from any other minority, or even, I'd say to them, and not everybody agrees, I may not be right, is I just focus on getting on with the job, you know, learning how to be a bricklayer or a plumber or a journalist or whatever it may be, and mastering your craft. And then later in life, once you have wisdom and you've got a respected position, then you can make arguments as a Muslim or as a Jew or as a Christian or as a gay person or whatever it may be, which carry extra weight for not simply being an activist. That's what I think. That's the advice I give to young people, but I'm not saying it's the right advice. Some of them strongly disagree.
Thank you, Peter and Dr. Barry as well. We're nearly at the end of the program, so we've got two more questions, Peter, for you. Saif, one from you. You have a question on your hand?
Yeah, so this is not my question. This is a question on behalf of Brother Wazir, and he asks from the book, Peter. It seems that Peter is not sure about the arrival of Muslims in Americas long before Columbus. Why is there so much hesitancy after so much scholarship with documented proof of their presence in Americas before Columbus? And then he goes on about related comment that he alluded to, that is Peter alluded to, that Muslims were in the USA from the Muslim world before Elijah Muhammad. My contention is that while there was a splattering of Muslims in Americas at the emergence of Elijah Muhammad, Muslims really started to come to the US in 1960s. That is his comment and question.
Yeah, I tried to, dealing with before Columbus, I think what I wrote was that there's a very meager documentation. The questioner may be that have seen much more up-to-date research than I did, in which case I may be wrong. But I was reflecting. There was a mythical element about quite a lot of the reporting, as you can expect, and if I might be wrong. And then I think that fundamentally, quite a lot of the early slaves who were brought across were Muslims, and that is well documented. And how they tried to retain their Muslim identity is a fascinating story. But yes, it's not Muslims started. I think you said that he says or she says the 1960s. It's an enormous Syrian movement towards into the US at the sort of around the time of World War I, of Syrians fleeing the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, going into the and one of the differences of the Muslim experience in the States to Britain is that they tend to merge much more naturally into the great American melting pot, whereas in Britain that's the adaptation has come in a different way. They've retained. Actually, I personally like that much more of the identity. I hope that carries on. I mean, that's the nature of, and British Muslim immigration has come since 1945. Well, you know the story of that, and it's followed all sorts of different patterns to immigration to the United States.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Last question from Rubaiyat. Rubaiyat, go ahead, please. Unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening, Peter. It was amazing to read your book. I've sort of read 1/3 of it, and I'm from Canada, so I was focusing on the first part in USA because I thought that would affect our foreign policies there. But I had a question. So, like, I've noticed how there's so much money pumped into this creation of this anti-Muslim narrative from the right-wing Christian groups, and even even in
Oh God, probably the connection dropped.
demonizing of people.
Yeah. I guess we got to the question, Peter. The funding, the money that are received by the right-wing organizations.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. It was interrupted.
So sorry. So my question is: instead of spending so much money on demonizing of people and making life difficult for them, is it possible to imagine a situation where you spend money to actually spread awareness about the richness of this culture or the contributions of these people in the society, and to even sort of invite people who are affected by this sort of right-wing propaganda or the kind of, like, fears, right, that people who don't know Muslims have, to sort of have them come to have, like, institutions where awareness and fact-checking is done, and also, like, employ these people to do that. Do you think that can be a viable way to foster religious or inter-community cooperation, and also improving the economic situation as well?
I think you're describing there exactly what needs to be done and is being done in quite a number of ways. Think about what Georgetown Institute is doing under John Esposito in Washington. It's one model, and there are fantastic organizations in Britain. I'm thinking maybe forward thinking. Here, I think the Muslim Council of Britain is greatly vilified, but it does some fantastic work in this field of spreading understanding. Of course, it gets vilified for it, and I think that you're one of the points you're making there is correct. That those right-wing evangelical Christian movements are incredibly well funded and use that funding in a way which goes against the teaching of, in my view, of Jesus Christ and the Gospels. So it's about inspiring kind of hatred and division and the communal effort, the common effort, which we all do need to do, is to tell a different message, the true message about Islam and about Christianity and what Christianity stands for, because there's lots of, and Judaism, what it stands for. I mean, there's lots of people who are ready both its enemies and some of its adherents of all the great religions, who are ready to distort the central message, which is one of love and love of your neighbor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rubaiyat, and thank you, Peter, for answering all those questions patiently. That was the last question for tonight. Our next program is, let me tell you a bit about the next program. Our next program will be a 7-part lecture series on applied multiplexity, Ibn Khaldun as an example, to be delivered by Professor Dr. Recep Şentürk. He is the founding president of Ibn Khaldun University. The series will start in February. More details will be shared in our WhatsApp group. So please feel free to join in if you haven't done it. So the link has been shared in the chat as well already. So we thank Peter Oborne again for taking part in our Meet the Author program. And we hope to have you more in the future as well to talk about your other books. We also thank our audience for joining in from various parts of the world and making valuable questions and comments. We are very much looking forward to seeing you in our upcoming lecture series as well. So with that, we are closing our program tonight. Goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed.